Well, when many people think of rare classic cars, often what comes to mind is something like a rare Corvette or a Mustang or a Camaro or a GTO. And in truth, there are a number of those vehicles that are indeed rare. However, if you're just looking at kind of an average run-of-the-mill GTO, Mustang, or Corvette, those actually have very high survival rates, and there are still quite a few around. But one of the things that you are not going to find often is a full-size convertible that has been relatively well preserved over the course of at least 50 years. Today we're going to look at the story of a 1970 Meteor Montcalm S33 Convertible. Yes, that was a mouthful, but let's do a little bit of history first on the Meteor brand.
And we'll do this because many U.S. consumers are not familiar with the Meteor brand overall. After all, it wasn't sold in the United States. It was only sold in export markets. So, we'll get the viewer a little bit more acclimated to what the Meteor brand was and what it was all about and why people would buy it in Canada.
And what in the world was this brand after all, the so-called Meteor? Well, it was just that, a brand, and it ran in Canada through the 1976 model year as well as export markets. And it was kind of an on-again, off-again affair in some cases, but most recently ran from 1964 to 1976 after a brief hiatus that started after the 1961 model year. Now, what in the world is a Meteor, you may ask? Well, Meteor was started by Ford Motor Company of Canada for the express purpose of competing against Pontiacs, and Canadian Pontiacs specifically. If you recall from other episodes, Canadian Pontiacs differed from U.S. Pontiacs in that they used Chevrolet underpinnings for many, many years. That was done for economies of scale, to save money, and also to facilitate having them built on the same production line. And it also obviated the need for Pontiac to import vehicles from the U.S., which during a number of years in Canada, it was just cost prohibitive given the import duties and fees that companies had to pay. So a lot of the Canadian cars, if you look at their componentry, is also locally sourced so that the auto companies didn't have to pay the import duties, as I previously mentioned. So Meteor was this brand that was sold in Canada and export markets, and it was sold through Mercury dealers. It was a lower-end brand, in effect, a lower-priced Mercury with a Ford interior and Ford underpinnings in some cases. And like I said, it was designed to be a lower-end competitor versus Mercury in the marketplace. Now, why in the world would you need to have a Mercury dealer sell the Meteor? Why doesn't a customer just go to a Ford dealer? Well, there's only about 35 million people in Canada, and it's a very large country by land mass. It's spread out. And so the dealer body is also spread out. And what that means is that if you have a dealer in a town, particularly a rural town, you need that dealer to really have a full lineup of products. And so, as opposed to just thinking that one could go to the Ford dealer and get a lower priced product, Ford of Canada decided that it was better to make sure that Mercury had a full lineup. And one of the other consequences of this was that you would see Mercury trucks in Canada, pickup trucks. You certainly would not see that in the U.S. And it's kind of funny. Some of the Mercury pickup trucks would actually use the wheel covers from the Mercury cars that you would see in the U.S. In any case, I digress. Let's talk about this particular 1970 Meteor Montcalm S33 convertible. And here is the actual car itself in the flesh. Now, this one is in okay condition. It's not in bad shape, but I thought that everybody would enjoy seeing it just given its relative rarity. And when I say rare, I mean very, very rare. This particular car was one of just 95 1970 Meteor Montcalm S33 convertibles produced. And it's amazing that this one survives today. It has a few options which we'll talk about, including the wheel discs, but it's a pretty awesome car overall. And certainly if you have one of these in the States, it'll be something that no one was familiar with. Now, this particular car was built in Oakville, Ontario, as was the case with many Meteors. And there were a number of unique components associated with Meteors, but they did share a fair amount of Mercury components as well. This, for example, was largely a Mercury Monterey body, and there was a unique grille and some other unique componentry to distinguish it as a Meteor, some rear trim pieces as well. And of course, being a lower end car, Mercury started with the US Monterey trim when devising this Meteor. And that's why it has the exposed headlamps as opposed to the closed headlamps of the Mercury Marquis. Now, one of the things I will say about the styling of this car, it's not necessarily my favorite. I think it's a handsome car. It's not a beautiful car. And take a look at the fender profile, just this very flat fender profile, very similar to the Mark III, except it doesn't have that bright work on the top of the fender. But otherwise, it feels very Mark III-ish. And also take a look at how relatively plain the body sides are on this car, especially compared to GM vehicles of the era. Here, the body side is just very, very simple and architectural. There's really not much sculpture to it, particularly that fender and then the door. There's a little bit on the door where you have this shoulder that comes out from the window glass. But after that, it just kind of wraps around and then goes down and tucks under like many various cars of the era. And you have the bright work, of course, that accentuates the side. But again, there's not really much surfacing either above or below that bright work. And the lower portion is a so-called drag section where the clay modelers likely just put a template there and then dragged it across the clay. And that's why it's a uniform section. Now, as we rotate around to the front end of this particular Meteor, we'll notice the toothy grille. For whatever reason, the Meteors often had a more complicated grille as their front end than the Mercuries. And, generally it didn't always look that great, I think. But they had to have something different. And, of course, you have the block Meteor lettering spelled out there on the header panel. So it is an authoritative front end, if nothing else. And I'm not sure what's going on here. It looks like the owner had added those fog lights at the lower portion of the bumper. Not sure why he or she would do that, but they're there. Now, as we rotate around to the side profile on this S33 convertible, you'll notice that it has this beautiful pinstripe that starts just behind the door, expands kind of as the body and the belt line goes upward, and then wraps around the rear edge of the quarter panel, and also this huge S33 lettering out back. It's a nice feature, and of course you also have the lower portion beneath the molding painted black. So one way to visually slim the vehicle is to paint that lower portion black, and that's what they've done here just to give it perhaps a thinner look. The black at least complements the black convertible roof as well. Now, interestingly, that lower piece of trim there that goes over top of the wheels and then runs the entire length of the car isn't really accentuating much from a body perspective. There is a crease that's just south of that piece of trim, and then the body tucks inward, as you can see right on the front end of the vehicle. Take a look at that black portion of the body in front of the car, in front of the front wheel in particular. But other than that, it really doesn't do much, and it's not accentuating any specific features. Again, this car has relatively plain body sides. And as we rotate around to the rear three-quarter view, we can see that S33 lettering there and the expanding pinstripe. And also take a look at the tail panel. Notice in the middle it says Meteor with a theme in that midsection there similar to the grille, kind of this very linear like line forms. And one of the things that I will also point out is the deck lid emblem there. Notice that it says Meteor in between the taillights, but that deck lid emblem actually says Mercury, and I'll zoom in on that in 1 second. 1970 was the first year that this was actually called the Mercury Meteor as opposed to just the Meteor. I suppose to perhaps denote that this was a somewhat upper level brand, not necessarily as premium as Mercury, but it was more up-level than Ford. And so for 1970, they started advertising these cars as Mercury Meteors. Now, in addition to that Meteor piece of trim emulating the front, you also have the haunches of the quarters emulating the front as well, where they're kind of pulled outward. And notice that the midsection where the deck lid emblem is a little bit inset from the peaks of the quarter panels and the edges of the quarter panels. Well, that's just one thing that added a little bit more distinctive look to these vehicles and created a harmony with the front end styling. And here's a close-up of that deck lid and the Mercury emblem. This is the Lincoln Mercury crest, although here it just says Mercury. On the U.S. marquee, as an example, that emblem would be red and it would say Lincoln Mercury Division. So I suppose they didn't want to say Lincoln Mercury because these vehicles might have been sold by standalone Mercury dealers in Canada, and perhaps they also wanted to separate the Meteor from the Lincoln lineup because it was, as I mentioned, a lower-end brand that Mercury sold to compete with the Canadian Pontiacs. Now, there unfortunately isn't a great picture of the interior of this Meteor, but you can see it here. Notice that it has the 1970 Ford wraparound dash, not the 1970 Mercury dash that was just this linear, relatively flat panel. This one also has the bucket seats, which came standard with the S33, the console with the horseshoe shifter, and somebody's put the incorrect steering wheel in this. This is from a later Ford. But I'll transition now to a picture of the Meteor interior. This one's a little bit ratty and a non-S33 interior. But so you can see the dash in these was indeed the Ford dash, a very beautiful dash. I love that wraparound theme that they had to it. And the great thing about it was that the passenger couldn't really control anything. Only the driver could. I don't know why they make it such that the passenger could control, as an example, the HVAC now in modern cars. I don't want the passenger controlling that. I want to control it. And they had, let's say it was somewhat challenging for the passenger to change those things on these vehicles. Now, this leaves the question of what's under hood in this particular Meteor S33, and this car has the standard engine for the Meteor S33, which is the 351 2 Venturi V8. Standard in other Meteors was the 302 2 Venturi engine. So it's kind of humorous in these so-called sporty vehicles, Ford just put the 351 in there. And that's because gasoline was expensive in Canada, even back during this time frame. So it was relatively rare to see Canadian cars optioned with big engines. You could, aside from the 351 two-barrel or 2 Venturi V8, get a 390 two-barrel. You could get a 429 two-barrel or a 429 four-barrel engine. By this point, the 460 was still a Lincoln exclusive. But you certainly had a range of engine options that you could get in your particular Meteor. And as we transition to the brochure for the 1970 Meteors, you'll notice that it interestingly doesn't list the horsepower for any of these engines. But the 302, I believe, was 220 gross horsepower. The 351 was 250 gross horsepower. The 390 was 265. The 429 two-barrel was 320, and the 429 four-barrel was 360 gross horsepower. So there's quite a spread between the bottom end and then the upper end engines, as you would expect. I'm a little surprised that the 390 wasn't a bit more peppy, but perhaps the two-barrel carburetor was bogging it down a little bit. Although the 429, 320 horsepower is pretty nice. I will say, somebody may say, a 429 with a two-barrel carburetor, how did that work? I have to say, owning one in my 1971 Marquis, it actually works very, very well. It's pretty peppy. It's lively. Of course, it wheezes a little bit at upper RPMs, but, it doesn't really matter. It's a very pleasant running engine. And the great thing about Ford two-barrel carburetors during this time frame was that they were reliable and they didn't bog. So you actually have more scoot from about probably 0 to 35, 40 miles an hour than the four-barrel carbureted variants, just because the four-barrels were kind of boggy and didn't always operate correctly, weren't great carburetors. And the two-barrels actually feel peppier around town than the four-barrel. So don't be afraid of a big block with a two-barrel. And you don't need to change it out either. They're actually really pleasant, unless you're trying to drag race somebody, which really is fruitless these days with a Toyota Camry going 0 to 60 in 6-ish seconds. There's just no sense in trying to make your classic car, all that much faster anyway. So what do you think of this Meteor S33? Put a comment in the comment section. I think this has to be one of the rarest Canadian vehicles. And I also want to encourage you to check out a Ford channel that was created by the poster of these pictures. It's called Yours in Old Fomoco Ironed. Lots of great videos on there about old Ford products, so check it out. Thanks again for watching.